Hello, welcome everybody. We are very lucky today to welcome Cable Griffith. Cable Griffith's work is shown in Uncanny Twilight, part of our Project Northwest series where we highlight different artists from the Northwest. And so Cable is the first of this series, and we're very lucky to have him here today. So join me in welcoming Cable Griffith.
Thank you. Hi everyone, you hear me okay? I'm really grateful to be here. I want to thank Jessica and Ellen and the whole TAM crew for their invitation to do this, to have the show and do the talk. They've been amazing and supportive. Very grateful for all of that and this place, and to be, I guess I didn't know at the time, but I guess part of an ongoing focus on Northwest artists is an honor. And looking forward to much more of that. And that Ralph Puget's show is in another gallery right down there, which I just got to see today, which looks awesome. So I will talk obviously about my work and try and kind of trace this path, essentially like telling a story of how I got to where I am now with the work. And the most recent work that I've done more or less is up in the gallery space. So I thought we'll start here and I can kind of trace that path through some images of previous work and influences and ideas. And then we can do a Q&A in front of the most recent work up in the galleries, which I think could be nice. But I also want to really encourage everyone to just be conversational throughout. So if there's anything like a question that comes up, I would welcome your, raising hand or even shout at me if I don't see you. I'm happy to just, you don't have to save it for the end necessarily. It's a real privilege to be able to do something like this. The exhibition, I think, is part of that, and being invited to reflect on the work and share some aspect of what I do and get the sense that people are interested, and you could have been anywhere. There's a beautiful day, no King's protest today, and instead you're here right now with me. So I'm very grateful for that. And it's a privilege in that it's also a moment for an artist to reflect and put language, or a certain form of language, I guess I'd say, to what it is that they do. And I think it is through things like this that have helped me understand what it is I do. I've always been kind of intuitively led, I think primarily, and kind of find understanding and meaning kind of through reflection later. So this is the process of preparing for something like this is important, I think, at least to my practice, as a way of kind of reflecting, connecting dots. It sort of both like forms a narrative and sometimes challenges or rewrites the narrative as I kind of think about how I got to where I am, and that inevitably informs the next decision of where I want to go. So let's see here. I have a scattering of some influences and some things just to kind of set the stage for some of the things that informed me kind of early on. I've lived in the Seattle area for 25 years now. I moved out here in 2000, almost 26 years, to go to graduate school at UW. But I grew up in the suburbs of New York City. I went to undergraduate school, studied painting in Boston University. So I've been in the Northeast for much of my upbringing, but I've lived here now longer than anywhere else. From that, growing up, my parents were thankfully really plugged into, or at least valued culture in a significant way. We were like a quick train ride to the city, and that I wasn't really aware of this as a young artist, I guess. But my dad, you'll see, he had the influence of this at least. My dad wrote ads for Atari game system when I was a young child. You'll see how impactful in some ways that was. And my mom, before I was born, was a cartographer working for the mayor's office in New York. So this idea of map making and video games is sort of, it's almost in my DNA. And and my parents had friends who were artists. We went in and saw museums. So there was this sort of privilege, really, this really fortunate atmosphere that I grew up in, where art making was valued and important, and a thing that grown-ups did. And as a young kid, that sort of gives a certain kind of permission, I think, to take that seriously. My biggest fear today, I'm usually pretty comfortable talking with people. I teach at Cornish College of the Arts at Seattle University. But my biggest fear is talking too much and not getting to where I want to go because we've run out of time. So I have a lot of images. I try to edit it down. I'm already talking too much. We haven't even gone past one image that's not even my own. So I'm going to flip through a lot of things, and hopefully we'll get somewhere where I want to get to, and we can kind of open it up and get in front of the actual work too. So some of my most earliest influences as an artist, as a painter, kind of around the time of graduating from undergrad, when I became really kind of connected and committed to this idea that this is what I was going to do. One way or another, I was going to figure out how to sustain an art practice. I knew nothing about galleries and making a living with art. It was not on my radar. It was not even something I really worried about. I painted houses, I made candles, I did what I was going to have to do to sustain the practice. But I was hooked by the idea that I could see the development through commitment to something. I saw that I was discovering things, and I saw that I was making things that I didn't know I would make, and I was suddenly kind of addicted to seeing, what will happen after a 20, 30, whatever year commitment to this. There was this mystery of digging through subconscious and influences and experiences to reveal something, and that to me was this seems, and I still agree, it seems like a life worth living. But some of the artists that I really resonated with around that time, when I was starting to kind of transition from observational painting, still life painting, figure painting, it was kind of a traditional academic environment, I started improvising, and it took a while to get the improvisations from my sketchbook, which was very fertile in that way, to the paintings, which was not something that was really talked about or even taught at my school. So it was right before graduation, I started basically putting the doodles onto the canvas, and everything kind of changed. Probably two of the most important painters to me at that time, and I'd say they still kind of are Arshile Gorky, abstract expressionist, and Philip Guston. And although at the time I wasn't as enamored with Guston's earlier work, that sort of came later, and I was really puzzled by Guston's work. It was sort of repulsive and attractive at the same time. And I can't spend too much time talking about them because we got to kind of move on, but I think it's worth acknowledging those influences. Another incredibly huge influence on me was Ed Emberley drawing books, and I don't know if any of you remember these. It didn't really dawn on me how important this was until much later, and I think this is like a lot of things. There was a period in my painting where I started to become really reductive in terms of the mark making. I was a lot more kind of gestural, like Gorky, really into kind of automatic drawing, trying to let spaces and forms emerge out of the ether. And that's still a thing that it really, really interests me. But I found that the complete connected lyricism of moving and the speed of it didn't work well with me. It was too impulsive. I would make 5 paintings on the same painting in a week, and it was too quick. And at a certain point, grad school helped me kind of figure this out, I guess, in some way, that I started to really reduce things. And I wanted to be slow and deliberate and let something build up over time. This was not on my mind then. But later on, I came across one of these books again. And I was like, oh my God, I just, if you could see, right, he shows you at the bottom, you're going to add this, you're going to add this, you're going to add this. And that's pretty much all of my paintings now are just like Ed Emberley simple forms. Saul LeWitt is another artist that has become, I think, increasingly important to me. not someone I was really aware of in undergrad, but since then, I think it's just worth mentioning before we get into things. As I said, I was really influenced in early video games all through my life. It's just one of those things where when you're as a kid and as a young artist or someone who just draws and invents all the time, it influenced the way I thought about representing the natural world or the world in general. And I became increasingly interested with like these parallels between really reductive early video game aesthetics and minimalist modernist aesthetics. And there's so many comparisons that I could make that are just sort of fascinating. But later on, I started to make these connections and thought like, wow, this is hugely influential to me. And as the technology progressed, I mean, I still play, like this morning, my son wakes me up at like 6:30 on the dot every Saturday, and we go down and play Minecraft. And today was like no exception, except it was a little shorter because I had to go to Tacoma. But I've been really like enamored by, as the technology develops, and kind of captivated by how the digital spaces become more and more immersive. This is a heady, big quote of the French philosopher and writer Jean Baudrillard, and I apologize for it. But I'll read just the first half of it. I think it's worth reflecting on, and it is, I think, at the kind of the base of a lot of things that I think about in terms of painting, and I think, unfortunately, just in terms of the world that we live in many ways. So today, abstraction is no longer that of the map, the double, the mirror, or the concept. Simulation is no longer that of a territory, a referential being, or a substance. It is the generation by models of a real without origin or reality, a hyperreal. The territory no longer precedes the map, nor does it survive it. It is nevertheless the map that precedes the territory, the procession of the simulacra. It makes me think a lot about how, in so many ways, the media landscape, social media is a huge part of this. People's profiles, people's avatars, it's sort of like the tail wags the dog in terms of identity, in terms of how we understand our reality, that our perception of what is real is so fragile and so reliant, of course, and influenced by the maps that we make. And it begs the question of like, well, which is the reality? Which is the model anymore? And there are those in power that leverage this understanding, even intuitively, to maintain and hold power. That aside, let's go to No King's protest after this. The Legend of Zelda was probably one of the earliest games where I was completely captivated and lost in the ability to explore it. Seemingly endlessly vast, and it's funny to see something like this in a kind of a map form. How much time I spent navigating this space. And at a certain point, when I started understanding these connections, I decided I was just going to kind of focus on this and see what happens when I just put these influences kind of at the front of my practice. So this was my attempt at a overworld map painting of an invented world. And I was, where you would, in a video game, you press start on your controller and you see the map, and then you kind of go in and you do your navigation through the world in more of a first-person view. So this was a first-person, I don't know if there's a pointer here, but so west from Pedal Mountain, you can kind of see Pedal Mountain as that thing sort of central right. And then way up here in the top right, you can see Pedal Mountain up there on the peninsula, and you would be on the right side looking west there across that water with those like purple mountains back there. So this was sort of like my way of kind of creating a virtual reality, or what if I could do some sort of world building that I can understand it in 3 dimensions and start to explore and track it. This was World 2 overview, and you can see this little hill to the left of that long flowery tree thing, this little mound. It's sort of like my Morandi landscape. So kind of tracking, making these world overview things as a way of like claiming some space and exploring through that, and letting the kind of reductive mark making that I eventually developed really seem to fit in a kind of digital data pixel, based environment where you're trying to be inventive through really restricted means, and going with what the limitations are of whatever the system is, and really just enjoying the kind of play with that and making some connections to both modernism and, of course, the kind of digital landscape environment that still really influences me today. That Zelda map comes in here. These two paintings are just like really iconic blocks, squares of rock pattern that I just repeated from both of those games. This is a detail of eventually a collaborative video game painting that I made with brilliant Brent Watanabe. We've done a number of collaborations over the years. I did the painting, he did the programming, but you could play this with actually a Nintendo controller, sort of an endless, pointless loop of consumption. So the paintings continued to move on and explore digital spaces and digital tools. I was starting to experiment with using iPads and Photoshop in some ways. You can see kind of these references to the stylus, kind of marks that a paintbrush usually can't do. It's kind of quick, rapid squiggles that usually is like a wrist motion maybe on a tablet. And all of these I felt like all of these paintings were just kind of experiments, you know? It's like, I still feel that way. Every painting is kind of a what if of some idea, of some kind of method, some vision of like translating the impossibly rich, detailed, complex natural world through a really like rigid, like limited, almost, I don't know, somewhat maybe naive system of mark making and shapes. Over time, the Northwest landscape started to become more and more prevalent, or at least I'd say like the longer I lived here, I started to go out and explore and go, you know, camping, hiking, and really get to know the Northwest, become sort of more outdoors oriented. I think it happens when you live here long enough, and it just inevitably, there some aspects of those spaces, the palette, the light, started to enter into the work. And eventually, some of the paintings started to really replicate actual locations. So it's kind of like moved from like fantasy worlds into sort of hybrids between like actual places. This is an actual place called Artist's Point in the Northern Cascades. And I'd gone there and hiked there, but I was interested in like kind of using some of my photographs, but also going through like Google Earth and other digital platforms to find really distorted, odd representations of those spaces and try to like blend them together. And I think, you know, the title of this talk, Cognitive Dissonance, is about a number of things, but I think I feel like throughout my work, I sort of try to occupy some space between two realities, two dichotomies. I think actual, virtual, digital, analog is some of them, and I think there's other thematic things that we'll get to. This was a installation that I did as an invitation from a great project. It was a domestic home, an apartment gallery hosted by artist Joe Rudko and Kelly Bjork, where they invited artists to do things on their two shelves that they had in their living room. And I loved the challenge of that. It sort of helped break outside of some things I was doing, but always maybe we just needed some permission to do. And really had fun arranging a painting the way you might arrange objects on a shelf, you know, or on a table, which in many ways is not that far off. I have there's a grid structure, right, of whether it's a canvas or whether it's a shelf, and I'm kind of placing these objects and, you know, trying to discover maybe some sense of like world making, and like the delight of being able to spill into an actual livable space was really interesting to me and was actually really impactful later on in some of the work and my current work. Soon after that, you can see some of the same elements. Brent and I collaborated again. We did an installation for a show called Push Play at the Hadreen Gallery at Seattle U. Here's a little GIF. There's one of the similar characters from a previous game that's projection mapped over painted objects and actual paintings and not painting on the wall. You can see they kind of like like float in the water. There's some like wonderful like basic physics. Similar theme of like consumption and death, essentially. I think those are the 2 points. I'm putting this on the wall to remind me that to sort of phase into some other thinking about some painting that's coming up. You know, I had been certainly enamored by a lot of artists who captivate these like grand ideas of landscape, Bierstadt among others. You know, they sort of set this this like incredible, overwhelming sense of space. You know, interesting thing about this is that like Bierstadt often didn't even know the places that he was painting sometimes. So they were these like really like over the top, grandiose exaggerations of the truth. And I started thinking about a relationship to landscape as a viewer, as a kind of a power dynamic. Like the function of a landscape is to be looked at, sort of to be consumed for pleasure. And thinking about that both as an artist, creating something to be admired, but also there was this sense of consumption. I don't know if you're aware, the theorist writer Laura Mulvey did this incredibly like important feminist writing called Narrative Pleasure and Narrative Film or something like that, and it really like illuminated this idea of the power dynamic of looking and being looked at, specifically in relationship to feminism and women as object often in filmmaking. But I couldn't help kind of get away from a similar relationship of observer and self to landscape in a kind of similar way. And you know, I started thinking about Bierstadt as like this incredible, you know, painter of the American West, but it was also, I think it's important to understand, his paintings were also billboards of Western expansion. You know, so there's like this beauty and this magnificence to them, and there's also this like underlying danger, even though that wasn't necessarily his intent, but you know, it was like portraying the land as this like endless resource, and where, you know, indigenous populations are, if even referenced at all, are certainly a side thought, you know, to an idea of who's sort of in control or who is this land for. So that comes back again a little bit later. So I have always been captivated with the narrative, the mythology, I guess, if you will, of UFO reports and UFOs in culture. And in some ways, you know, I'm a little less interested in whether like aliens are real in here or not. Like, it would be amazing if they were. It's also amazing if there aren't, because what really captivates me is the way it has lodged itself in human psyche. Like, regardless of religion, regardless of like cultural histories or location, there's this something about this that has captivated us. I think this, despite all of our confidence in terms of dominating the world and landscape, there is this anxiety about what maybe we are capable of. Like, are aliens and UFOs kind of a reflection of like our fear of what we could be? Are they like a promise of who we want to be? You know, it's sort of murky, and maybe it's both. And so I had been doing research on this and cataloging sightings, not knowing what I was going to do with it for a long time. And then finally, I think through thinking about the role of landscape painting and the idea of the sublime and the uncanny, which is you know, a big theme in a lot of painting, of like, especially with someone like Bierstadt, capturing this sort of like overwhelming, almost terrifying beauty of a natural environment. And I just started thinking about these scenes of how landscape is involved in a lot of these settings, but there's this sort of other kind of looking back out of nature that's sort of mysterious and very unsettling. And I was really also captivated by all of these reports of people who saw something incredible. Whatever it was, I don't know, but their willingness, their drive to report it and talk about it and share it, in a way I felt like a kinship to them, because I'm like, that's kind of what artists just do also, right? these sort of visions or imaginations of things that like, I see it this way, I saw this, I had this idea, I want to share it with you. And I started thinking about the reports, and so the body of work I did called Sightings, it's still kind of ongoing. I kind of dip into it over the years. I did 3 sub-series in the show. Some of them were, you know, in the conventions of maybe like a grand sublime landscape painting. These were taken from descriptions of the reports, specific reports that I found. And the titles are from those descriptions, like exactly. So all the information I could figure out, like the time of day, the location, kind of roughly influenced my decisions. But this was just me kind of riffing off of what someone said that they saw without any other visual guide. These were slightly different. So these are actually exact master copies, right? So like what I was doing with Bierstadt is sort of within the tradition of, you know, copying a masterful painting as a tribute, as a way of sort of learning about their technique or whatever. And in the same way, I tried to honor these artists who submitted these drawings, and I copied them exactly, like exactly. The only thing I omitted was maybe their writing of the things that they saw. And so the titles of these paintings are from those reports. So I love these little poems in a way. I never was skeptical and always had an open mind, believe in the impossible, so to speak. That's the one on the left, and a crude sketch of what I saw on the right. There's just something beautiful about what these people are doing and sharing, and it's just so earnest and direct. And these aren't artists, but they're just like driven to make something, to communicate this. And I just sort of find it really profound and beautiful. That's not the moon. Okay, so there's a lot of things going on at the same time in the studio. There's often like what happens next, what just happened, and what's happening now. There's kind of a messy, sloppy transition of ideas and things that are always kind of happening. As that was happening, this idea of what if I dealt with a landscape instead of asserting an idea of something, like, or claiming a space in terms of like a power dynamic, what if I approach the canvas with maybe an intention to make something, but I'm acknowledging something that is already there, and I'm rather than this asserting sort of dominance over the blank rectangle, and have a dialogue with something, and acknowledge that there's this material first and foremost, within the tradition of Western painting, I guess, often canvas. And coming off of that show at Joe Rudko and Kelly Bjork's 2 shelves, and thinking about domestic space as like a location also. Like making painting in a domestic space of domestic objects with these domestic-oriented materials. You know, there's something site-specific about that, to use kind of an art term, but I've always had a home studio. Always, my whole life. It's been in the basement or wherever, usually the basement. And I started thinking about applying kind of these, you know, how do I make maybe a grid or some structure that can illuminate some possibility for me to build work into it. And I started using a fold die to create a grid. It's just, basically you're just using the canvas as its own stencil or resist in a way of blocking out certain areas and highlighting the edges of the fold. This is how one is generally done. It's sort of like an accordion fold. You fold that thing up and use clamps and wood and squeeze it really hard, submerge it for an hour or maybe more, and I end up getting this grid. I usually work with like 4-inch grids because it's for a bigger piece of canvas. It's just too hard to fold it up tighter. And over time, I've gotten a little bit better at this. I still feel like a total novice, but this is actually then in order to get the 2-inch grids, which is what this is, I have to do 2 4-inch grids offset. And so I do the dye bath 3 times, one to get the base coat, then 2 versions of the lines. Sometimes the lines are the same, usually. Sometimes they don't have to be. So I started experimenting with this, where I'm having this call and response with the material. I'm still in search of landscape and exploration, but I'm having like a dialogue with this thing. that already has begun, and it's sort of outside my control. You know, like a grid is like, it's an idea. It's not really, it's like a mathematical principle, but it's not really a thing. We all understand what it is, and we can picture it, and we can try and draw it, and machines can try to replicate it and print it. But I'm really attracted to like trying to achieve this perfect thing through this domestic-oriented process. And, you know, I'm spending time with this cloth, and I'm ironing it, and I'm folding it, and you know, there's a whole lot of underpainting in a way at first in terms of ritual that then gets developed, and over time I start responding to that. So this is happening at the same time also, and I'm thinking of like locations, actual locations, and photography of the hiking trips, the camping trips, is starting to become more influential in terms of source material. So I'm thinking about using these images, and I'm thinking about them clearly as digital images and ways of bringing that in without like illustrating them. I'm not really interested in that. It's already closed off, and it's already complete. I've got to leave room for improvisation, for discovery, for something else to happen. And so I pretty quickly realized, of course, that just that really generic pixelization of an image, where you're removing all of the like quote unquote important information, really still leaves so much. There's structure, the grid is there, the light is there, the palette is there, without any of the specifics. That leaves me room to sort of find a new place within this sort of echo or memory of this referenced place. So this starts happening as I'm doing the fabric work. So this idea of the grid and the pixel started to connect for me. And these are all like regional places, Seaview, Washington, out on the peninsula. Some of them are more dense, and some of them are more, scattered. This is another example of where the photographic process started to become really integrated in a slightly different way. The grid is still there. I'm still referencing quilting or domestic wall hangings through images. This was a commission actually through a show at Bellevue Arts Museum. And I found historical images of around the Lake Washington region, the earliest photographs of the area, which not too surprisingly are all logging industry photos. So it's sort of wonderful to see. I wanted to be like, what is the earliest photo evidence of this area? And of course, it's tied to industry. It's about ownership, right? It's about dominance. It's about all of these like problematic things. And around this time, forest fires are of course nothing new, but it was starting to become like coming back as a significant problem, at least since I've lived here. So I first. This is like a UV sensitive paint. I would paint over, it's sort of like a cyanotype process, but you could do different colors. So I had, I don't know how many of these are, you could do the math, I guess, but they're all separate negatives on film that I created, tiled. Every one of them is separate, kind of arranging them in my studio, and then these halogen lamps that probably exposed it. I had to do it in sections. The exposures would be several hours to get it to burn in, and then you wash the stuff away, and then you dye the fabric red, and then I would kind of paint over it, and you can see kind of this like fiery firestorm kind of coming out of this. So this was really fascinating to me, that I could use photography as a kind of analog Photoshop way. What could I do with it, And so this is another example. I had all these from that project, and I just started kind of improvising new landscapes. These are all like bits and pieces from all of that old logging imagery. And I would burn that into a canvas and then paint over it and see like what happens. And in this case, this is a horrible photograph, but I happened to find this kind of rare state. That turned into this. So I was like, oh, that was a lot of, why did I do that? That was like a lot of time and effort to kind of come to something that felt more familiar. Again, I don't really often know where I'm going with the things, but these are just sort of the things that happen, experiments that, so I spent way too long on this painting, but it's sort of interesting that it kind of, again, came out of the fabric, so to speak, right? It kind of came out of this kind of random, seemingly random situation that then I tend to kind of delight in improvising out of a problem. So that's become a theme overall as I kind of create these problems for myself and try to find my way out of it towards maybe something that makes sense. Along the same time, as I was developing that process, I got the opportunity to do my first public project for the airport. And I think in some ways, because I had to work digitally for this in terms of the scale, to have it be fabricated, the digital processes became even more kind of a part of my process. I was interested in how efficient it was, coming off of the painting I just showed you. But this was a real honor, a real privilege to be able to do this. There's much more I could say about public art. I'm kind of just folding this into the path of my painting work and my ideas kind of that connect all this. But I got to say it was mind-blowing to be able to work with teams of people that could do things I couldn't do, that could see things about my work that I couldn't see. That they saw possibilities that I just didn't, I had no reference point to understand how this would look, how this would interact with the light. I'm very grateful that I've been able to continue doing some of this work. Approaching Storm, I don't know, this was sort of an offshoot painting that was never part of a show. This idyllic kind of Eden-like place. A lot of the forms in my work, you never really see figures, rarely, human figures, but there is this consistent idea maybe that this is maybe post-human. There's something about the natural world that is evolving in some new, interesting, strange way. These characters tend to play out little narratives. Sometimes the characters are specific and more literal, and sometimes they're maybe just more suggestive. Trump was in office, things were getting strange at the time. Continuing to the title Approaching Storm is, I think, some acknowledgement, some reference of that. Of course, what it did not see coming was a pandemic, which happened a year later. And I'll kind of go through this quickly. You'll see sometimes, I've noticed that my work will go from abstraction and kind of a clear, a more openness maybe to the grid and a minimal approach to building things, and then suddenly I'll want something really literal and clean and direct. And I think, especially coming out of, considering where we are in terms of control or a lack of control or agency in one's life, the desire to make something literal and tangible, and this is this. I can't help but think that there's a connection there. But these are my kind of I guess, COVID isolation paintings. They're all these kind of landscape paintings that are sort of closed off, isolated, separated, trying to huddle together, surviving entities in some kind of otherwise maybe vast or unknown exterior space. Through making these paintings, I started playing around with VR as a tool. I've always been captivated by technology. I think it's a double-edged sword. I think I've often been really seduced by it and disappointed by it. And I continue to kind of maintain this relationship, except when something new comes out, I'm I want to try the new toy, and it's novel and it's exciting, and I want to see what I can do with it as a tool. I think often I go through a process of that, and I tend to kind of come back to the things that I maybe know best, but I found myself still interested in this. You can see the relationship of the painting on the right. That came after creating this in a VR sculpting program. I could move it 360, I could light it, and then basically kind of created a little world and then painted it directly. I played around with the same thing on the right that came from actually a sketch on paper. Then I sculpted the thing in VR from that, and then made a painting based on that. And I was at first you're this is I found the new thing, and then I do it once, I'm yeah, all right, fine, but it certainly is I am guilty of indulging in some of this, and as just a curiosity of tools and seeing what it does and what it can't do. And sometimes it often reminds me of just what is most important that technology can't possibly really help me with. This is a mosaic, one of 5 mosaics I did for the Redmond Transit Station. A very similar process to what I did for the airport, except Tieton Mosaics in Tieton, Washington, found a process where that they could water cut, basically like an automated system of cutting through glass, where they could cut all these separate pieces out and fit all the different color pieces of glass together like a giant complex puzzle. It was astounding what they were able to do. I never expected that they could actually do that. I thought they would translate it in some other, maybe more conventional mosaic way, but the technology had just kind of reached this place where all of a sudden they could replicate them almost identical. I mean, my digital drawings pretty much just looked like this. Adjusting to color palettes was a little tricky, but you could see, so this is actually a photo collage. It's not a really drastic one, but for almost all of this work, I kind of skipped ahead of this a little bit, that the airport piece, that was all my own photography, that then I'm like puzzle piecing together to make some really complex collage. You digitize it or pixelate it, so it kind of it unifies it in a way through the abstraction. All of the like discrepancies or irregularities get kind of hidden. This one, you don't see too many. There's like a few edges. I tend to use a real soft kind of like filter brushes and things to smooth it out, but I'd created this little space that then became that. So this becomes that. You can kind of see the forms there. And this is when they were finally installed. Oh my God, I know I'm so over time. Oh my dear God. Okay. This is actually from the same photograph. So I took that process after working in public art and digitally for a while and started kind of applying that, just going back to painting, having these images, pixelating them, and then slightly reconstructing them, often from memory. Sometimes I'd go to the photograph just to kind of remember maybe a specific thing, but there's so much of the DNA of that image is in that pixelization that I was able to improvise and kind of reconstruct. Fair enough. I'm not trying to make the thing whole again. I think I'm trying to find something else that's sort of between the image, the memory of the image, and maybe the memory of the location, since all of these are kind of directly connected to like a personal experience. This is actually 2 images, one of a forested space and one of my living room kind of together. This is like this tension between an interior and exterior. Each one's kind of fighting against the other, which is something that became increasingly really interesting in my most current body of work. So this is an example of how one of these paintings develops. I have no idea what the image is going to be. I'm just kind of making these as grids. There's, to me, these become, over time of using these, they become more and more, I think, an important symbol of domesticity, of like having a home studio, and an understanding of the labor that goes into even having an art practice at home. Especially with a child in the house, when I get to paint, there is labor happening to allow that to happen. And in the family of my wife and I are both artists, there's a dynamic that we have to understand, we've grown to understand, of how to make that work. So these are, I think, fundamentally, it has become kind of a maybe poetry for me, metaphor of this structure of the space, the structure of the home that needs to be in place in order for everything else to happen. For all of the creativity, for the risk-taking, for for all of the play, is built on that foundation. And that has become increasingly kind of central to the work and a connection to what the subject matter of the images are. You can see this kind of evolving. So this is actually an image of my wife and son up on Rainier. Just pixelated out. The audience doesn't need to know that, and I don't think I really looked at the photo much. The information was there, and then I'm kind of creating this other sense of place that really just integrates the two. This is actually out in the window of the gift shop. This is a piece that I did with my son. He does these fuse bead things, or he did for a long time, perler beads, where you get these pieces of plastic and you iron them together. And he did this one that I just was really astounded by. It has this symmetry, and then it breaks with the symmetry, and I just loved it. and decided I was going to do a painting of it. And he helped me mix all the colors. He helped me dye the grid. He helped me paint in all of the squares. So we replicated that on the large scale. It's probably about, I don't know, 4.5 by 5 or something like that. And then I improvised within that. And then I get pulled back into the sightings series. This was also coming out of some ideas during COVID, during lockdown, during the kind of isolating at home. They didn't get finished till a bit later. I was kind of sitting on this project. But these really about being inside, being isolated, being with family, being scared of what's happening out in the world in general, being really unknown, the unknown of it all. And these are actually both cases. This is a drawing that my son made of a UFO, and we just taped it to the window there. And he gave me a bunch of drawings of UFOs, and that is one of the ones that I picked I thought was the most interesting. So yeah, going from something like this where I'm like, I never want to paint a realistic thing again, like it's so tight, I'm done with it. There's like this ebb and flow, sort of whiplash effect, where I go from one thing then to maybe it's opposite. I was hungry for improvisation and then sort of unknowing. Like this, I know where I'm going, and it's hard to maintain energy for me when I know where it's headed. Although the result is still satisfying, but I've been like, I think over time, it's again the cognitive dissonance of these two things of like knowing and not knowing, and trying to find some sweet spot in between where there's like this real openness and freedom, where I feel like I'm discovering something, and yet saying something that is clear and rooted in my own influences, in my own environment, in my own experience. Painting is several images coming together. So this is, I think, what the current work is really about: images and multiple images having tension. It's not important to me that the audience knows what these images are. But I do, and I know where they're from, and they represent sometimes things that are incompatible with each other. Things in my life, experiences, ideas, locations, moments in time that then create this tension, but also this opportunity to find something new. So this kind of brings it up to the most current body of work. Again, kind of oscillating between the dyed canvas work and the work on paper. The kind of a literal, illustrative nature that the influence of Guston is like really still strong. This is probably the first figurative painting I've done in maybe 20 years. They were trees and then they turned into feet. I just remember laughing out loud in the studio when it happened, and just decided to just sort of roll with it. The last gallery show I had at J. Rinehart, I was really struggling with this idea of narrative, and I'm just messing with the mic. Sorry. Like what I was talking about giving a talk like this, where you're expected to tie things together. You refine these narratives about who you are, what your work is, what you're about, and I think sometimes that ends up, again, the tail wagging the dog a little bit, where you end up feeling like, well, this is what I do, so I got to do this. I just finally decided at this last show, I was like, the show's gonna be whatever the hell is happening in the studio. And this feels like older work to me, but it feels like more informed by all the things. Like all the things are here, but it feels like maybe a painting I may have wanted to make maybe 10 years before. And I'm just sort of not worrying about that as much. This is probably the most significant painting of the most recent body of work. It's just larger, more in-depth, complex. In a nutshell, it's in several locations that have really kind of distinct meaning for me, locations and points in time that were folding together. Things I was thinking about, and this kind of like tension of those moments. Two rotted old growth stumps on Vashon Island, a studio space that I was working with. There's kind of other images embedded in there, and yeah, again, this kind of like coming together and also this negation of multiple areas. So this is in the studio right now. I'm kind of building off of that. Again, multiple images kind of coming together. Trying to find, I think this is done. I think so. We'll see. It's like, I took this photo last week. And excited to see, where the work goes from here. I'm sorry I went so long. I really appreciate your patience in being here. I would love, if anyone is interested, if you've got to go someplace, go someplace. But I would love to go up to the gallery in front of some of the work there and do a quick Q&A if you all are interested. Thank you so much for all of your time. I really appreciate it.
Where the title Rhizome Palindrome came from?
I'll try to answer that. So it's specific, for me, it's specific to the images and the tension that these images represent. So the idea that something can be dormant, that is fertile, that can grow and go away and come back, and that it can loop. In this case, I think there is sort of that can be positive, that can be negative, it can be somewhere in the middle. But that's, to me, what what the title refers to, if that makes any sense.
So palindrome meaning sort of this.
Same forwards, backwards,
Yeah.
but I sort of see it also as like maybe like something that has a rotation to it, something that can come up again, something repetitive, an echo with itself.
You don't see the word palindrome very often, so
It's also a fun couple words to put together.
Yeah.
Are you planning on doing any more public art? You were talking about the mosaic pieces that for Redmond. I'm one of the other artists who was part of that project. And I just wondered if that led you to consider doing more mosaics or more public artwork.
I would love to do more. As you know, it's a lot of work just to apply consistently enough. It's a numbers game in so many ways. I think I've had an assistant for a while to help me apply, and it's like apply to 60, 80 things, and there was a year we got nothing. And it was like, okay, is it worth justifying the costs? So I kind of pulled back a little bit. Also, when they hit, it's a lot of work. It's like a lot of work and then nothing for a long time. And that with, to other things in life, a full-time job, I pulled back, but I want to get back to it again. I just haven't, kind of retreated for a little bit, but we'll see. I want to make more mosaics. That was very satisfying, and I would love to see that continue, but we'll see.
One of the things I think that sort of fascinated me is as your work has, I've seen it kind of progress and shift and still kind of be self-referential. Like you'll go out on a little tangent and you'll come back and one of the things I think that unifies your work over time is this kind of dedicated, unfussy, singular brushstroke. Like there's an integrity to the way that everything ends up, like that's kind of the signature that goes through all your different iterations. And I'm wondering what your relationship to that is, because it seems it is such an identifier. And it's so especially considering if you started out with the, when you toss the gestural kind of expressive work aside and what that meant and how your relationship to the making of that has maintained through all this time.
Yeah, thanks, David. I didn't really address that. Thank you for bringing that up. I think that I mentioned a little bit that there was a desire to reduce marks in terms of process, and I think why that has held for so long, I really love the thought that there's this relationship or a visual ecosystem, I kind of call it, where there's a clear relationship of parts to whole through the whole like evolution of the painting. Even as something kind of closes down and to be like more specific and representational, it emerges out of like kind of an ether of marks that start to suggest something, and I love that space. I love being able to be like, again, like witness to the thing as it's kind of coming into being. And there's a freedom in it, but there's also like, there's an accessibility to it. Like I like being able to see the part to the whole, and there's like, it's not really mysterious in a way. It's like, it's just that thing and that thing. And when you get enough things, it makes a new thing. And to me, it becomes like maybe an interesting parallel to the natural world. We're all like, you know, big things made of smaller things made of smaller things. And it's become like a useful way of just like letting things organically develop. And there's also this one last point to that. So there's this really great quote by the jazz pianist Herbie Hancock, that he was playing with Miles Davis's second great quintet, and that during some solo maybe, he played a wrong note and was kind of like mortified that he had played this wrong note playing with Miles Davis. And Miles came in and played another note or two that then made Herbie's wrong note correct, right? Like he kind of created context, made a chord out of the note that didn't fit before. And I find that to be so relatable and beautiful. And so I think of the grid often as like, especially when like reducing an image, like in a pixelization, there's like, it's like the key is set, the tempo is set, you know, like the composition is set. And there's still this beautiful freedom to improvise over the chord changes that is kind of there. And there's a long span of time where like, I could do anything right now. And it feels like wonderful and like, you know, just discovering. And over time, you know, you create the thing, or again, like the problem. Sometimes I intentionally put things in that I know negate the thing I love the most. But then there's this puzzle of like, what's the next note that makes that thing work? And that's just like a personal delight. But I think it also creates something hopefully visually interesting, and I think has become kind of part of what the most recent work is really about, is like embracing and engaging in that, the opportunities in that tension. Thanks for that. Yeah, I like working on a number of things at a time. So like right now, I probably have 4 paintings kind of happening, but I'm also like, when I'm stuck on a painting, which happens a lot, I'll just start dyeing the next fabric and have no idea what I'm doing. And that it has become like a really important meditative just practice. Like I can go to the studio and get to work without having to worry about what it all means or what, you know, or anything else. So I pick a color, I've got a fabric, I see what happens, I make the dye. I start accumulating these canvases on my wall, and then, you know, eventually it starts to suggest something. So it tends to often get me unstuck, is just doing the dumb work of, you know, the process without any of the painting. So, but yeah, I tend to bounce around too, from thing to thing. It just keeps me going, because I can only really paint on something, I don't know, a couple hours, and then I usually need to like give it a rest. So if I want to, I can move over to its neighbor, you know. Yeah, thanks for that. There is something I love about creating something vast, like this overview, this impossible view that you know, it's not a first person. There was a transition, I mean, in a way, oddly enough, it's sort of like from the airport piece to the Redmond transit station piece. It went from this overview vista to like in the woods. And I think that has maybe largely come through working with my own photography, which is first person on the ground. So it tends to be a little more immersive now. I do have like this desire sometimes to think more in terms of map terms. Like that painting is, I think the title is Map Head or something like that, and it was kind of a map for a long time, and it became more like a head form. But there's this, that like micro-macro relationship that I think is really interesting, and maybe some of the more abstract pieces still maintain, like it's like something that's not quite in focus. So maybe it could be a little bit of both, you know?